Hello, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a place where myself, Glenn Ford, and this guy, Mike Hutchinson, a couple of games designers, have chats about designing better miniatures games. And returning from our separate, chat bubbles, we're back having lovely head-to-head conversations because we've managed to reorganize ourselves a little bit. What we're thinking of chatting about today is if everybody can throw their minds back about a month ago, we were doing some conversations about the history of tabletop miniatures war games, where they came from, what some of their sort of origins and roots are. And what that's been making me sort of think and speculate on is, what are some of maybe the original assumptions that came out of what they were originally based on? Is there a sort of alternative history world where these games were based on something different, a board game or a tabletop game that's around at that time that did things differently? And maybe whether imagining how else they might have been is a good way for us to consider some of the assumptions that are maybe built into our processes when we design these games, and whether we should consider something different in relation to those processes. So, I mean, to launch off, as an example, we were saying before in the historical videos, these games are based on chess primarily. That's one of the core games that it sort of built out from and grew from.
Right, yeah. The Kriegspiel grew from one man's experiment extending chess into a more fulsome battle game.
Yes, and sort of extending the board, extending the options and things.
Mm.
And the first thing that sort of makes me think of is that chess obviously is a combative game. It's about combat, and a lot of tabletop games, sort of early tabletop games, are based on combat because it's quite a simple story. Everybody understands, here's my guys, here's your guys, you have to get rid of my guys, I have to get rid of your guys. It's a quick way of presenting things to people. One of the other major sort of subjects that early tabletop games are based on is racing, because similarly it gives you a very nice clean story. We're all here, we've all got to get to there, first person there wins. It's like an instant, okay, everybody knows what everybody's doing and everybody understands pretty much how they've got to do it. The reason I think it's interesting to think about is that racing is obviously also very concerned about the relative position of your playing pieces, your markers. It's all about sort of relative position, the location of things. It's about sometimes moving around stuff, finding lanes of overtaking, finding position between other markers. I mean, obviously with Gaslands, we've spent a while thinking about racing in relation to tabletop miniatures games. One of the other things that racing has to do with normally, and something that isn't Gaslands, is not removing the other person's pieces as you play. And I do wonder if whatever would have been Kriegspiel, or whatever would have been the progenitor of these kinds of non-discrete miniatures games, would have been one of the many ancient race games, as to whether we would not have this sort of, frankly, obsession that combat is the one subject that is suitable to tackle with these games.
Right, it would certainly have made Gaslands an easier design, not having to deal with the sort of, there's post-apocalyptic car combat, so things have to explode, which is lovely, and I love it. But your point is well made. It's like, well, if Formula One was at the old Waddingtons game that I played a lot of as a kid, was more like central in the genesis of these games than the two-sided combat simulation of chess, then yeah, maybe some other interesting, different. Maybe the scales would have been completely different, and most things would have been about chasing each other around, or racing, or car chases, or parkour chases, or all the kinds of exciting all the kinds of exciting action movie tropes that you get from chases, which are perfectly reasonable and delightful cinematic things that sometimes have some shooting, but very, you know, people don't necessarily die a lot in chase scenes, just a lot of Uzis get shot.
Yeah, it's not inherent to the process. And it is funny where, like, with Gaslands, you know, once or twice there was this discussion of, are the guns super necessary? Because the guns make creating a race quite difficult. They make balancing it quite difficult because
That's right.
bullets travel really fast. You know, and inherently, if you are trying to balance out a race game, the fact that somebody has a rocket causes issues with that. And I think it's interesting as well because it's like, you know, the Rule of Carnage Discord is full of you know, independent games designers who are interested in challenging assumptions and looking at like how these games can be done differently. And I do pop up there and I say maybe these games shouldn't be about shooting each other in the face. And the concept of that is very hard to sort of present to people who are part of this hobby. That the instant assumption is, well, I can't begin to imagine one other reason why I would care about the relative position between two things, other than because I want to point a rifle at the other guy, you know, and put a bullet in them. And it's so like, well, that's weird. Lots of games have cared about these sorts of things and haven't then given everybody shotguns, you know?
I mean, it's not what's interesting as well is it's not an exclusive problem for sort of miniature tabletop miniature games. Like there's also it's very difficult to find a video game, like it's not impossible at all, but like a ton of video games are also super obsessed with you know, extinguishing the lives of NPCs and manhandling weapons and swords and guns and stuff. But like as we talked about before, like board games have reached a point where the vast majority of board games are not about sticking your sword in a goblin. Obviously, there's an enormous subsection of the pie chart that is about sticking a sword in a goblin. But, you know, there are lots of video games about, you know, making economic centers in a city, just as there are lots of board games about, you know, manipulating the economy. But there's something about the manipulating of miniatures and like action kind of video games that have both really centered on this, like the exciting peril of there being physical harm done and being risked.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is to do with that ease of explaining the story. There is that sort of, you know, the conceit of, well, what am I? Well, you're that guy and you've got a gun, and he's that guy and he's got a gun. Now that's explained to you a lot of what your motivations and aims are. I just think that simplicity does exist in other areas, and I think it's very significant that race games are one of the most ancient sorts of board games because it gives that story in an extremely simple way. And I do wonder,
it's very easy,
if they had been the origin story as well.
So I mean, the other thing I suppose is that I like your idea of this, of catching on the story there, because as I'm thinking about other kinds of traditional games, like particularly dexterity games, for one reason or another, I was looking at the history of Knucklebones this week, and that's an ancient game with so many varied like parallel evolutions that it's essentially like just appears to be a human nature to take small objects and do dexterity tests with them. But what's I think different there is that like that sort of tabletop game, which I think has some interesting parallels with the sort of non-discrete nature of miniature games, doesn't have the same, I don't know if it's like sort of respect for the little objects being in their positions and sort of, you know, having to think about them and consider them. And so in a way it's like, well, if you'd have started from Knucklebones being the beginnings of, like, you know, the tabletop miniature hobby, I don't think you've ended up with the same thing, because these miniatures are fragile and they have to be, you know, they're beautiful objects, and they have to be like, in many regards, it's like collecting a set of porcelain pigs and then bringing them to someone's house and laying them out for them to consider at their leisure. And so in a way, the game has to be, if not sedate, it has to be respectful enough of the little playing pieces that they don't get touched that much. And so I sort of, as I'm thinking about alternative histories, I'm not certain what happens if you say, well, all playing pieces have to be, manipulable in a dexterity game kind of a way. Like what would have happened? Because I guess if you take, wooden or, carved chess pieces or something, like you could do dexterity games with those, that'd be fine.
See, I think that's one of the other sort of things I've wondered about the sort of alternative history, is that I had always assumed, and I think there are places in like H.G. Wells's Little Wars where he sort of talks as if he assumes that the process goes something along the way, along the lines of somebody somewhere produces some lead soldiers because small boys like collecting lead soldiers.
Yeah.
And then small boys have lots of lead soldiers. And so somebody else writes a game for those small boys to play with their lead soldiers and sells them that. And for a long time, I'd sort of thought, well, that's probably a significant part of the root of it. And it turns out it's like, no, not really. There was chess, and then we used chess to make this game, and then somebody made lead soldiers for people to play the chess evolved game with, sort of that it's not the lead soldiers weren't the evolutionary process. The game was the evolutionary process, and then lead soldiers.
Yeah, I'm not certain if that's true or not. Like, obviously, we told the history with that as the sort of sequencing of it, but I don't know if that's parallel. Like, Kriegspiel emerged. Also, toy soldiers were an obvious thing for a boy to be receiving in 1870 or whatever, and so the two things kind of discovered each other.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things, like in relation to H.G. Wells, there's that wonderful mechanic of the little spring-loaded pop gun for knocking over other people's soldiers for doing shooting. And obviously that's a non-abstracted version of doing combat. And we abstract the hell out of doing combat in these games. Combat is always abstracted. It's always it's a collection of numbers facing other numbers, sometimes with some randomizers sprinkled on top. And this is one of the things where I do wonder if it was a more sort of toy-based sort of evolution, or if that toy-based sort of offshoot that Wells was looking at there had continued to be, a broader thing, whether we would see, and not necessarily
right. Yeah, no, and this is partly the thought experiment that obviously I go through. Me and Phil Smith went through at Offspray went through to get to Gaslands, and obviously I have done, and anyone who's enjoyed Gaslands and thinks that they might design something similar has also gone through of like, what other toys do the kids have that might be cool to play with? And so, obviously your mind goes to like, okay, there's like Lego, and obviously there's games like I can't remember what it's called, like Zero Frame or whatever. Like there's a Lego sort of mech game where you have to build the things, or you look at Plastic Dinosaurs, or you look at like, so it's interesting that, like, as you say, like toy soldiers were there. Somebody was like, well, we better make a game around these toy soldiers. But like, surely everyone had little wooden wheeled objects, cars, carts, whatever. Everyone had farmyard animals and horses and cows and stuff. And like, we talked before about how like there's an interesting moment in the sort of early 2000s where like computer games discovered that there were like farm things that you could do that were completely different. And so like, everyone's got a farm set. Why isn't there just a normal thing that you do, which is like, I don't know, like almost like a play by mail, where you set up your farm in your house, and like every morning as you drink your coffee, you have to make 2 or 3 strategic farming moves, and then you come back the next day.
Yeah, or it's things like there's the role-playing game Dread, or Starcrossed, use Jenga towers as their resolution systems. And it's like, I'm not necessarily saying that you should have a resolution system where somebody's beautifully painted miniature gets like a chunk of wood thrown at him to see if he gets knocked over. But there is an option here to sort of consider what other physical resolution systems can represent what's happening that could maybe happen slightly to one side of the tabletop. Can we have Jenga towers as we're playing? Can we have dominoes? Can we have other ways of resolving things other than this very, very abstracted version of
oh right, yeah, so sort of two sides of the coin there, where there's like, we've got physical objects that could be used to represent like the players in our story, whether that's toy soldiers or little plastic army men, or it's cars, toy cars or whatever. And then you've got like, well, what have I got in my house? Well, I obviously had a D6 from my Monopoly or from my like Ludo or whatever. I also have a deck of cards. Like, what else have I got that could have ended up being the, you know,
Yeah, a sort of
the
sharp
default.
AP system to do your shooting. It's like
Right.
that could be more around. So relating back to other possible offshoots that could have come out with different tropes for these games, I was thinking the other day about Hafentafel, which I never pronounced quite right, but the Viking version of chess. And what's interesting about that family of games is that they're oppositional combat games where one player has a smaller central force and the other player has a considerably larger surrounding force. And obviously chess has us both line up quite neatly at opposite sides of the table with perfectly balanced forces and then play out a combat. And Hafentafel doesn't have any of those things, and still to this day we're playing these miniatures games where, yeah, we've got our asymmetrical sides in that they can do different things, but we will be furious if they are not balanced like to within an inch of their lives for every single point we spend.
Well, plus every fantasy war game has its one Hafentafel scenario, obviously.
Yes, the last stand surrounded, things of that nature. I just think it's like the idea of breaking the deployment zones in these games seem still, after 100 or a couple 100 years of making them, seems incredibly revolutionary.
That's true, right? So if you visualize the starting setup of a chess game is literally the deployment zones. It's broadly speaking the same proportional width of like a 12-inch deployment zone.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd never quite made that connection. That's really strong.
It's almost a photocopy. The distance between the two armies, the distance that you get to deploy in, the fact that you're both along your table edges, and the fact that you have armies that are meant to be of exactly equal power is
and then of course I don't know about you, but I spent some of my youth playing Battle Masters, whatever the MB, like, which is basically chess, but you've got little plastic army unit things.
Yeah, exactly. And if maybe Hafentafel had been the thing that Kriegspiel was based on, maybe the idea of lining up both of your armies on your table edges would be crushingly boring, and who would even consider such a thing?
Or incredibly exotic, and we'd be talking about, oh, can you imagine a world where you've lined up armies?
I mean, we have
a field of each other. Ooh, exciting.
We always have these broken deployment zones dotted all over the tabletop, and that instantly create a story and an emergent form of gameplay. Why don't we just all line up on our table edges? Wouldn't that be exciting and unusual for us? One of the most sort of obvious things in many ways about chess, which is weird in many ways for a tabletop game, is that it is a two-player game. Right. And two-player is the standard for these sorts of games, whereas, you know, Pachisi, for example, a very ancient Indian game, and that's a four-player game, or you can play it with four people.
Right, and most traditional card games are super flexible on this. Like, it's interesting because like there are obviously like some absolutely towering and important games that are two players, like chess and Go, and like these huge, but then so many more of the social and traditional games are built for the family environment, or, you know, like 8 people around a poker table or whatever. Like, there's a lot of not two-player games, and I suppose we've spent a lot of time trying to make war games that are designed for 2 people work for more than 2 people. And it's frustrating and irritating, and it turns out that there's lots of design challenges. So it'd be super interesting, yeah, as you say, to say, well, what would the world be like if just by default you were expected to be playing with 3 or 4 or 5 people? Which, interestingly, like with Gaslands, and returning to your idea of like, what if we were all playing Ludo and race-based games? Like, races don't care about 2 sides, because the setup doesn't care about 2 sides, because we're all setting up in a line pointing in the same direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's, to consider the idea that, you know, what if 4-player had been the default for these games?
I mean, I suppose in this case, is this one of these sort of intersections where quite a lot of battles are fought between two armies, and therefore chess is a two-player sided thing, and therefore because we're using toy soldiers and its armies and it's based on chess, like it just is two people. Obviously, you know, obviously lots of battles are way more complicated than that, and like it could have been like, it could, like, what if the default was you didn't control the army but you controlled, you know, a detachment or whatever, and everyone's expectation was, well, no one controls a whole army. Like, what a bizarre way of, you know, that
Yeah.
would be representative of how you would consider the battlefield.
Well, this is one of the ironies that you know that there are sort of historical battles where, you know, two main forces are lining up, and then there's the kingmaker who's sat there trying to decide which side of the battle he's going to join in on. And then one of these games tries to recreate that sort of a battle, and he goes, well, this is an insoluble problem. There will only be two players. How can those two players have this third force sort of deciding where it's going to? It's an enormous number of battles are based on, you know, alliances and allegiances, and somebody coming in with a relieving force from an unusual direction, or somebody sat in a hill overseeing the battle, deciding where he's going to throw his sort of 10 pence worth into it and decide the fate of the nations. And the fact that whenever we try and deal with some of those ideas, we go, oh, I don't know, only two people play, so we'll have to abstract out this third force and make it about rolling on a table, where it's like, maybe if the default had always been you play with 3, 4 or more players, every game would have like a set of systems for playing those kinds of battles out. Everybody is always, it's one of these things generally personally that mildly irritates me, is when a game says it's for more than 2 players, and what it is it's for 2 players, and then you add people onto a team on one side. What we'll do is we'll play 2 players, and then one person can watch me move the army around, and I'll look at them occasionally, and they'll go, yeah, I guess, sure. We're a team now. Now we're playing 4 people. It's like 2 teams playing each other is not multiplayer. It just it is.
Although it can be fun, but I take your point. Although back to your Kingmaker comment, like it's far from all multiplayer board games that have escaped that problem where, you know, mid to late game there's, you know, 2 people who can win and 1 person who can't but can decide who's going to win, and, you know, it never feels good in those, even in, like, you know, abstract Euro games or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, sort of actual politicking and king making, when it happens accidentally in a game, is obvious. It's an awful thing. It's one of the things you constantly have to try and fix. I mean, it's sort of a balanced game built around way of simulating a real world kingmaker, I think, is interesting. And I think there are interesting ways of doing teams in games. It just, whenever I sort of pick a game up and it goes just form teams, similarly it's like when I pick up a co-op game and it's like, well, what this is a solo game, but then sometimes there's more than one person kicking to death a big monster. It's like, well, it's not really a co-op game, is it? I don't actually need the other people here. I could just work their stuff myself, couldn't I? Yeah. So I think, you know, sort of the one other thing here that I sort of big game.
One other thing is, what if all war games were played for money?
No, the big sort of combat-y kind of game that you mentioned in passing here that would have been interesting had we evolved from, I think is worth mentioning is Go. I think we'd be living in an interesting sort of world if the spaces transcribed by your miniatures as they move around the tabletop, you know, geometrically, would become important. I think that's an interesting thing to think about anyway in miniatures games. I often sort of we put things down on a tabletop and they are markers and they do constantly create triangles and squares and shapes between them, and we very rarely sort of go, all right, okay, look at that shape, maybe that shape has a quality.
Oh, actually, yeah, no, there's an even simpler way of saying that, which is like chess is at its heart about the dynamism of pieces. It's about the movement of the pieces, whereas Go is about the placement of the pieces. And so what if by default you started with all your miniatures off the board and essentially the deployment phase was the entire game, and it was just like, there'll be a horse there, there'll be some cannon there, and things reveal themselves like a fog of war kind of receding, and nothing ever moves. It is where it is. You know, maybe things get destroyed by being surrounded or whatever. But yeah, you can certainly imagine a game where nothing moves and it's perfectly interesting and tactical and replayable.
Yeah, and also I think that there's something. I think there's something relatively there's something simulationist about the thing of saying, well, what isn't really dangerous is, you know, this guy with this gun shooting at you. What's really dangerous is the the no man's land, the kill zone that is being produced by this many people being in these sorts of positions. Um, you know, as you say, chess is a very sort of, I'm here and you're there, and we're going to move towards each other, and then we're going to interact in the middle because it's a certain sort of warfare. I think the thing that's interesting also about Go is that it's about, okay, well, this now is a sort of death zone. I've created a death zone by setting up things around the outside of it. I own this area. You know, you come into that area at your peril in many ways, and I think that that is very simulationist of what actually happens, particularly in modern combat. And the fact that it's really extremely rare to say, okay, it's not this guy shoots at that guy, it's this guy and these two other guys have created a zone, and that this zone is now covered by them and is unbelievably fatal to go into. And maybe these zones are slightly less and these zones are slightly less. And I think, again, if we had sort of, if something like Go had more sort of weight within the creation of these games, we might be looking at this thing of considering the zones between miniatures, considering the areas of pressure and zones of control being sort of put out on tabletop. Because still, it's like, you know, if you look at high level play in miniatures games, people talk about zones of control and areas of control and threat ranges
and force projection and
force projection for various miniatures, but it's still incredibly abstract and it's quite a high level concept for high.
It doesn't tend to be very crisply rooted in the game mechanics. It's more of an analysis tool for the sort of strategic level of the game. So I think there's a few things I think that Malifaux's really good at that sort of zone of pressure and death zone thing, and I borrowed it for, you know, Billion Suns, and A Billion Suns has this really direct thing where, like, if you walk into the square, everyone will shoot at you and you'll probably die. And I think that one of the games that I'm working on at the moment is sort of pushing itself into a place where I'm thinking, like, in a way I perceive, this is going to sound a bit derogatory, but it's not what I mean. Like, I perceive Go as a bit more like a zoomed out strategic map of the world, whereas I see chess like a bit more brawly, insofar as there's like individual pieces maneuvering around each other. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is that the most zoomed out that miniature games tend to get is like the full field of battle, as if you were viewing it from a helicopter. And as soon as you go more strategic to that than that, to a map of, you know, a broader territory, then you're either playing a campaign in which games will occur, or you're playing a cards and counters war game. And, you know, our brain transitions away from miniatures at that point because the sort of scaleness of them doesn't make any sense anymore, and so we kind of discard them. But I guess I continue to be interested because of spaceship games, where, you know, me and, you know, many other spaceship games like, you know, Battlefleet Gothic or whatever sort of say, hey, spaceship miniatures are cool, scale in space is nonsense, don't worry about it. Like, imagine that these are like flags and I've zoomed into them super and the scale is completely irrelevant. These are, you know, thousands of miles apart, even though the miniature is, you know, 5 inches long. And so in one of my new designs, I'm sort of thinking about this much like that sort of Go scale. Well, it's like, well, the interaction between pieces is what's interesting. The fact that they're miniatures is an aesthetic choice. I mean, that, I suppose, is part of the comparison, which is like chess has a range of forces, range of units within the thing, within the force, which all have different capabilities. And so, you know, another thing would be, well, what if that is a weird and strange idea and things are contextually powerful or weak rather than arbitrarily powerful or weak, and that's the default. And having, you know, having different sizes of Go pieces is kind of an exotic mechanic that we've invented, and well done us.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, that is a bit of a passage of a flight of fancy, something I wonder about, but I think something
That's good. That was interesting.
I think it's something that's relevant to say is to consider some of the assumptions that might be part of your design for reasons that are historic rather than that are necessary to do with what you're working on and what is actually relevant to you. And some of them we've literally sort of laid out as, look, here's the history, here's where that idea came from. You know, it's not a bad idea, but maybe it wasn't yours. But you can sort of consider that, I think, about most of the elements of your games. And you know, challenging tropes is often difficult because, you know, they're helpful for players and they know what's going on with them, but sort of maybe tweaking some of them and questioning and going, well, what else can I use, what else is around, what other inspirations there are, I think is potentially useful. But for now, I think from this episode of Rule of Carnage, in this conversation, we're probably going to sign off. If you've watched through to this point, please do roll down to the comments section. Tell us what sort of ancient game you love that you would like to have been the origin story for these sorts of games, how you think games might have changed if they were based on
Uno, the battle game.
Yeah, on a very ancient and noble game like Uno that you might enjoy. While you're down there commenting, give us a like, drop into the Discord and join in this sort of conversation that rolls on around these sorts of subjects. But for now, it's going to be a thank you and a goodbye. So thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.